I often see Alabama being compared to Sweden, but I never see Massachusetts compared to Bosnia. Why? People generalize all of Europe to resemble the Nordic countries and all of the United States to resemble the Deep South. It is disingenuous. Story 1. Sweden isn't as nice. If you want nice, come to Norway. We have cookies, oil, and money. Sweden only has Volvo and bullets. We even told Sweden they could join our oil ventures if they gave us some shares in Volvo. But they just played some Swedish dance band music, opened a tin of surströmming, and shuffled their way onto the bus. Story 2. Having lived in Massachusetts my whole life and having had the opportunity to travel in Europe, I can say this post rings true. Story 3. Bosnia is actually not so bad. In my opinion, the worst areas in Europe are some of the semi-abandoned post-Soviet towns in Ukraine and Russia. I have never been to Belarus, so I cannot comment on that. I like Bosnia a lot, although there are some problems with ethnic tensions and unemployment. Story 4. I have never seen anyone do that. The comparisons to Europe I usually see revolve around their density and walkable neighborhoods. Story 5. I constantly see Alabama being compared to Sweden, but never Massachusetts compared to Bosnia. Why? Equal footing. Alabama and Sweden are both developed regions with high GDP per capita that haven't experienced war for over a century. The purpose of making a comparison is to illustrate how improvements can be made. It is not a contest of superiority between America and Europe. Story 6. Personality and aspiration. I have been to Bulgaria, London, California, Colorado, Missouri, Florida, and Zambia. One observation is that many countries adopt a more collectivist approach to their societies. I notice that many Americans might be happier in countries that, while less wealthy, prioritize public transit, biking, walkability, multifamily housing, and ample time off. In any society, there are individuals whose personality types may not align with the culture around them. America is no exception, and many people who feel out of place often find themselves daydreaming. Story 7. I think in Europe we often hear from America, "We are the greatest country in the world." And perhaps it serves to remind them that they may not be as great as they believe. Story 8. Because Europe as a whole is not claiming to be the best. The noise is coming from our side. We need to look in the mirror first. Also, Massachusetts still has much higher health, transportation, and education costs than places like Germany or Bosnia. If you live in the southern United States, northern cities in the United States, Western Europe, and Eastern Europe, you get a pretty good idea of the differences. There is not an agreed-upon proper way to compare two different situations. Just vote with your feet. Story 9. I think it's the same reason that people who say music now is terrible compared to the best music of my youth have an opinion they don't want to be challenged. Story 10. Wait, what? I've only seen the opposite so far. Europe is praised as a utopia in general, with its worst parts being considered better than the best parts in the United States. Story 11. Most people engaging in this, particularly in English, are Americans from less urban areas who visit Europe a few times in their lives during vacations, spending a few days or weeks in popular tourist destinations. By definition, their experiences only encompass the best parts of Europe. Few people spend their holidays in post-industrial former Soviet bloc states during winter. They also do not stay long enough to really miss quality Asian or Latin American food. Additionally, they wear the rose-tinted glasses of vacation, being more relaxed and in fun mode instead of the work and chores mode they typically inhabit at home. To delve deeper, they do not experience what it is like to pursue an education, seek employment, buy a house or apartment, pay taxes, or navigate the bureaucracy involved in living in any country. They are also unlikely to speak the local languages fluently. This limits much of their interactions with locals to 1. Those employed in the service industry, whose livelihood depends on keeping tourists satisfied, and 2. Locals educated enough to have learned English. Neither group provides great insight into how the average person lives, works, and thinks. Many Americans may be surprised to learn that millions of Europeans hold anti-abortion views, support the death penalty, and possess unsavory perspectives regarding Middle Easterners, Africans, and non-heterosexual or cisgender individuals. In summary, these individuals compare their lived reality to the fantasy of their 2 weeks, or more likely 10 days of a curated Disneyland experience, mistaking it for real life. Story 12. I can compare Bulgaria to Los Angeles, and Bulgaria still wins with its clean skies, mountains, and nice views. In Bulgaria, they may sell your kidneys on the black market, but in the United States, they can shoot you while you're walking down the street. I am not even from Bulgaria, and you don't want to compare the United States to Greece, Italy, or Spain. Forget it. Story 13. It is called confirmation bias. People try to prove a point, so they look for evidence that supports their thinking and ignore information that opposes their view. Story 14. Don't worry, it gets done the other way too. They would never do this in New York when talking about London, etc. Story 15. I know, right? Even the Nordics have their issues. Peaceful old Sweden has an alarming ethnic gang problem where the weapon of choice seems to be hand grenades. You can say what you want about gun crime in the United States, it's appalling, but per capita, we are surpassing Sweden when it comes to hand grenade murders. Story 16. I can't answer your question, but on a related note, why do people only think of a few countries when Europe is discussed? It's strange. Generally speaking, this happens not just during comparisons. When anyone talks about Europe, it usually involves the Nordic countries in Western Europe, plus Italy in Southern Europe and Germany in Central Europe. The rest is often overlooked. Story 17. Most people compare the United States to Western Europe, and the saying essentially holds that the United States is the best place in the world to make money, while Europe is the best place to spend it. Story 18. Whenever someone says America is a terrible country, I always ask, among America, Britain, France, Spain, and Germany, who do you think has the most problematic history? If you compare the 3 worst atrocities committed by each country, America wouldn't even come close to any European country. However, I acknowledge that it's not for lack of trying. Story 19. Because Europe and the European Union are different, the most accurate comparison is the United States to the European Union. Comparing non-European Union countries to the United States is nonsensical. Story 20. Because they want to convince you of something they don't even believe themselves, they intentionally make comparisons in bad faith. Story 21. Alabama has some great places. Huntsville is really nice. I got an offer to keep my current salary, which was heavily considered, but I would have lost all my hobbies. I declined because I enjoy climbing, hiking, and skiing in my backyard. Story 22. Even the best parts of the United States have rates of poverty and violent crime that would be considered total social collapse in Western Europe. Story 23. Well, generally they are looking to draw comparisons to models of what they want to do as evidence that it is achievable and as an example of real-world outcomes. Pointing out the most struggling areas would be similar to holding up Frank Reynolds as your role model, wouldn't it? Story 24. It often comes from Americans themselves. A fairer comparison would be something like New York or London, Los Angeles or Madrid, San Francisco or Berlin. I have seen these places compared fairly. Story 25. Probably because the media you consume is often created by people who visit Europe only on vacation and therefore only see the popular tourist destinations. It's similar where I live now in Germany. Many Germans have a very idealized view of the United States as well. They tend to focus on Route 66, California, New York City, Texas, and the national parks in those areas, along with Las Vegas. Sure, we could discuss the stereotypes, such as Europeans referencing school shootings while Americans bring up historical conflicts, but these mainly exist online. Story 26. Mostly for financial reasons, the worst parts of the United States still belong to a country that is wealthy compared to the European Union. It is a separate nation, so it has a completely different financial situation than the wealthier countries. Story 27. You are judged on your worst attributes and compared to their best because there is a perception of standards or an archetype that a group must adhere to. Good deeds do not erase bad deeds. Europe has its fair share of judgmental comparisons, so don't worry too much. Additionally, America is young, and the new arrival is always compared to the established group. Story 28. In all honesty, if America were such a great nation, it would not have Alabama for comparison. It is not just in that state. People working 3 jobs just to survive is common everywhere. While the wealthy accumulate wealth, we toil so they can become even richer. We allow a handful of companies to dominate the food market, enabling them to raise prices without competition. What does that mean? Fewer business owners and more low-paying jobs. Corporate greed is strangling this country, and our legislators are in their back pocket. Meanwhile, we argue about who can use which bathroom. It's beyond reason. Story 29. As a Swede, it is easy for us to not consider places like Bosnia, Albania, and Moldova as part of Europe. They are viewed as Eastern Europe, which we do not identify with Europe. The same applies to some extent to the developing countries in the south, such as the southern half of Italy. Story 30. My pet peeve is the accusation that Americans do not want to leave the United States for vacations. Perhaps it is because we prefer to explore our vast country in depth first. It offers a continent's worth of natural wonders, national parks, cities, resorts, historical locations, and more. Mountains, deserts, forests, you name it, we have it. There is an endless array of things to see and do here. No passport required. It is amusing to listen to Europeans discuss their upcoming vacation to the United States. They have 10 days and expect to see Manhattan, Disney World, Graceland, Yellowstone, and Los Angeles, all by car. Story 31. Wouldn't it be more accurate to compare nations as a whole? Why compare Alabama to an entire nation when it is only one state? Additionally, comparing the best parts of the United States to the worst parts of Europe is impractical, since it is one country versus a continent. Comparing Bosnia and Massachusetts is not a valid comparison. Let's compare Bosnia with Ecuador. Story 32. The differences between countries in Europe are minimal compared to the differences between any European country and the United States. When it comes to free healthcare, essentially free education, and vacation time, a minimum of 4 paid weeks, there are notable contrasts. Poverty levels vary significantly, even within countries. For instance, traveling from Munich to Frankfurt reveals disparities. However, in terms of social aspects and worker protections, whether we examine France's 5 mandatory weeks of vacation or Serbia's 4, the situation is distinctly different from that in the United States, be it California or Mississippi. Story 33. Sweden is not the best part of Europe. It is cold, and in the winter there are only a few hours of sunlight per day. It is terrible. The best countries are in the south. Story 34. There are also many positive aspects and redeeming qualities in the south. It's a bit of a mean-spirited generalization. Story 35. Why do you have to hate on the south? It has lovely people and places, much better than Massachusetts with its awful roads, cold weather, and high taxes. Boston is nice, though. The south is like Italy, with beautiful beaches and significant tourism, but has a slight gangster mentality. Story 36. Grandfather, innocent, shocking, outgoing, oil, sable, straight, snow, toy, historical. Story 37. Bosnia. Affordable healthcare, housing, and public transit. Massachusetts. Disregard all comments. Story 38. They want to feel better about the troubled state their country is in due to their choices. Last I checked, even the southern United States isn't facing daily hate crimes and ethnic terrorism like Sweden is now. It's just unfortunate. Story 39. Half of the United States is a rundown Detroit, and the other half is San Francisco's progressive ideology. There is no in-between. Story 40. Because Europeans have a strong resentment towards the United States, their countries are inundated with American influence and culture, while they feel their own countries have little relevance in the United States, which frustrates them greatly. Story 41. Europeans often exhibit a sense of superiority. That is why I like to ask them how they feel about the Romani people. Story 42. Because they know very little about the United States and are merely looking for things to criticize. They want to argue that the entire United States is terrible and that Europe is better. This is the easiest way for them to make their point. They disregard the positive aspects entirely. Story 43. You do not see the same levels of wealth in Europe as in America for the most part. However, you also do not observe the same levels of utter despair in Europe as you do in some parts of America. This highlights the inequality associated with the American model and its implications for those who are less fortunate. Story 44. People can be foolish. Alabama has some beautiful places as well, although I would still prefer Sweden due to its lower humidity and obesity rates. Story 45. People argue on the internet for attention and to stimulate brain chemicals, using various logical fallacies and cognitive biases to make their points. Story 46. Sometimes it's because of gross domestic product. The worst-off states in the United States have gross domestic product per capita similar to some of the nicer countries in Europe but a lower standard of living. People want to understand why that's the case. Story 47. By the standards used for these comparisons, the Nordic region is not just the best in Europe. It is the best in the world. Similarly, the deep south of the United States, while not the poorest part of the developed world, is the least healthy and least educated area that most Americans recognize. The purpose of these comparisons is to highlight the best and worst outcomes possible in a highly developed economy. It demonstrates what it looks like when a modern, wealthy nation excels, and what it looks like when it falls short. In this context, the comparison is informative. It does not use Sweden as a representative of all of Europe, nor the Mississippi Delta as a representative of the entire United States. Instead, it illustrates the range of possibilities. Story 48. The irony here is that you are comparing a subcontinent to a nation and then complaining about unfair and unequal comparisons. Compare nations to nations and proceed from there. Story 49. There is something called benchmarking. Considering the United States budget and advancements, they believe life should be better, admire Sweden, and use it as a benchmark. As a Bosnian, I would not live in the United States no matter what. Besides India and Thailand, it is one of the worst countries to live in. The majority of research reports high rates of life satisfaction in the Balkans, higher than the rest of the world. We live simple lives, work to live, not live to work, and enjoy nature, healthy food, and leisure. Despite relatively low income, the majority has home ownership and life security. Homelessness is not common in Bosnia, so the consensus is that the United States is not ideal. Story 50. Picking Sweden as an example of the best part of Europe. My country's government has a travel advisory for Sweden that indicates a high degree of caution, but there is no advisory for Alabama. Story 51. Instinctive gold is distinct and scarce, can be frightening yet also relieving. One must be cautious and intelligent when dealing with it, much like a doll that must be carefully juggled. Story 52. I think most people find it surreal and jarring that you can send your kids to school every day thinking they might suddenly be in danger. Story 53. In the United States, we can be frustrated with the problems we face. When we learn that things can be better, we often make comparisons. In the European Union, there can be a sense of self-righteousness regarding the issues in the United States, leading to further comparisons. Bosnia is not in conflict with Massachusetts, and Massachusetts likely has little awareness of Bosnia's existence. Story 54. It has become very trendy for some Americans to express disdain for their country. Many progressives openly say they want to see America destroyed. This movement has taken on an extreme and harmful perspective. It is rooted in hate. Story 55. People are comparing the United States or parts of it to European countries of equal development level. The United States is among the richest and most developed nations on the planet, so it's fair to compare it to other countries in that category, which in Europe are mostly in northwestern and central Europe. Former Eastern Bloc states like Bosnia and Poland are not at the same level yet. Story 56. Not really. The United States has a distinct culture compared to Europe, regardless of the region. I have been to Europe many times and can confidently say that walking down a downtown street in most European countries often feels like a fashion show. People are dressed up for shopping, unlike those in the United States who may wear casual outfits. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.